After my last update on the 5 women murdered in Whitechapel, in the East End of London, from research and with the amazing work and book by Hallie Rubenhold, I will start with one woman at a time, for there is much to say, and it's important for me at least to show their differences, from childhood to their tragic murders by the so-called, quotes, Jack the Ripper quotes, of whom thousands of books, films, TV series have been made since the silent era of films. We will not dwell on these women's deaths, but look only at the way they lived and what happened in their lives as best as we can, or I can. I'll try not to go on too long. Forgive me, because I often get caught up in the minutiae of history. To reiterate, their names were Mary Ann, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. In order to give a sense of London, I will start briefly with the summer of 1887. 1887 was the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, which, as many will know, marks 50 years of her reign. During the 19th century, London grew enormously to become a global city of immense importance. It was the largest city in the world from about 1825, the world's largest port and the heart of international finance and trade. Railways connecting London to the rest of Britain, as well as the London Underground, or Tube as we call it, were built, as were roads, a modern sewer system, and many famous sites. Like all cities, London was a tale of two cities in one. One aspect was the West End area, and this was and still is the hub for theatres, clubs, hotels, beautiful parks like St James's Park. People streamed in this Jubilee from the suburbs and tenements to try to catch glimpses of the Queen, or princes and princesses, royal heads from all over Europe and the then Empire, even the Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani, who was in attendance. So there was a massive influx of thousands celebrating, watching fireworks, etc. The romanticised view of ladies twirling their parasols, dressed in lace-trimmed, bustled gowns for garden parties and balls, is the one we often hear of at this time. But there is another version. And this version is one which only a small amount of history books have been written about. The Jubilee year of 1887 was incredibly hot, so out in the rural areas such as Kent, say, which was famous for its fruit and vegetables and agriculture, the crops and the fruit shrivelled. There were water shortages. Many traders came into our famous Covent Garden market to look for work or to try to sell any produce they had. With no money for lodgings, they had no choice but to sleep rough in the nearby square doorways, etc. Many did this rather than face going to the hideous and demeaning conditions of the workhouses. Indeed, my great-grandparents were born and raised in the East End on my mother's side, and my grandfather, at the age of 5, in the early 1900s, ended up in a workhouse. But that's another story. Gradually, there were thousands camping in Trafalgar Square, using the fountains under Nelson's column to bathe and wash their vermin-infested clothes. As autumn came in, so did the Salvation Army and other charitable organisations, handing out Bibles, tickets to lodging houses, coffee, tea, bread, soup, etc. The impact of this massive encampment obviously brought in the police, which then brought in, as it does today, the journalists. And as many know, that's how Charles Dickens started, as a journalist. I know where his lodgings are in High Holborn. They are now office quarters. But around that time, There were slums and alleyways crammed with people. These are mostly gone now. Yes, I've digressed before starting to talk of the 5 women, but this was the atmosphere, or an atmosphere if you like, to think of at the time, just to give you a picture in your mind if you like. So in Whitechapel, which is the East End of London, at the time of 1887, 1888, we have this massive overcrowding of people, working, looking for work, marrying or not, as many didn't, having families and literally trying to survive day by day, minute by minute, if you like. I'm going to begin with Mary Ann Nichols, who was known as Polly throughout her life, so we'll stick with Polly. Polly was born on the 26th of August, 1845, and murdered on the 31st of August, 1888. Polly was a blacksmith's daughter. Her father's name, Edward Walker, her mother's was Caroline Walker. Edward, her father, had trained as a blacksmith in Lambeth, on the opposite side of the Thames to Fleet Street. Fleet Street was the hub and hive of printing books, journals, newspapers, and densely populated. It has been said in the records that it was so full of human traffic going about their business of printing that from Ludgate Hill near St Paul's Cathedral one couldn't see anything but a dark, confused, quickly moving mass of men, horses, vehicles. So by the time of Polly's birth, her family were living around Fleet Street. The living conditions were of large and small alleys and passages, lined with rotting wooden structures, damp brick buildings, which had been the homes of printers, thinkers, and impoverished writers of the 17th century. Everyone so crammed in you could hear your neighbour sneeze, wail, or sigh. Polly and her family lived in a 200-year-old dilapidated house known as Dawes Court on Gunpowder Alley. This area Charles Dickens used for his famous Oliver Twist. Indeed, Polly lived in the same lodgings as the fictional Fagin and his pickpocketing boys. Life is indeed stranger than fiction. Polly's family were not wealthy, nor likely to be. So as I said, Edward, her father, he trained as a blacksmith in Lambeth until work along the, quote, Street of Ink, Fleet Street, came to beckon him. He started with making locks and then possibly the creation of the typeface for the printing. Being a blacksmith was considered a respectable trade and might bring in between 3 and 5 shillings a day. They had 3 children. Edward, born 2 years before Polly, and then after Polly, Frederick, 4 years later. Schooling at that time was not compulsory until 1876. The more well-off of the working-class parents would often send their boys, and occasionally their girls, to local charities or fee-paying schools. Polly was one such girl, as it appears her father believed in education for his daughter too, so she was allowed to stay at school until 15. She learnt to read and write. This was indeed a wonderful bonus. They moved house, ending up in a place called Harp Alley. Space, privacy, etc. were unknown. The streets were still of medieval standards in places. The houses, as noted in an 1844 inquiry, were called, quote, some of the worst conditions, badly ventilated, filthy, quotes. Most families share one room. Average size was about 8 to 10 feet by 8 feet, and from 6 to 8 feet tall from floor to ceiling. Because of the cramped conditions, in the spring of 1852, her mother, Caroline, became ill with symptoms initially like flu, gradually developing into a severe cough on the lungs. Her health deteriorated, and it was clear she was riddled with TB, an airborne disease common in those areas of London. She died in November that year. So Edward the widower and the 3 children, the youngest Frederick, he was not quite 3. Edward, unusually for the time, undertook the sole care of his children. Rather than leaving his children with relatives or committing them to workhouses, he manages, and it seems with the help of his wife's sister Mary Webb. Sadly, little Frederick passed away 18 months after his mother, again of TB. Even with the help of the aunt, it was necessary for Polly after her mother's death to become the cook and look after the family's needs. It seems from the records Polly and her father had a unique, strong bond. So once her duties were done around the house, she was still carrying on with schooling as best she could. In 1861, Polly met a 19-year-old man named William Nichols, who was living in men's lodging nearby. William was the son of what is known as a herald painter. This was someone who traditionally applied coats of arms on carriages and signs. William was born in Oxford, but had travelled to London to train as a printer. So somehow Polly and William met, possibly through Polly's brother Edward. He has just been described as a young man with a broad sunny face and light hair at the time. In 1863, a marriage proposal was made and accepted, and on the 16th of January 1864, 18-year-old Polly and her young man were married at St. Bride's, which was known as the Printer's Church. The register states that William was a printer by this time. The two stayed living with Polly's father, but as expected, 3 months after the wedding, Polly was expecting a child. William Edward Walker Nichols was born on 17th of December 1864. By autumn 1865, Polly was expecting again, and so the need for a larger home was becoming obvious. So in the summer of 1866, both families moved to 131 Trafalgar Street, a terraced 2-storey brick cottage, surrounded by carpenters, machinists, shopkeepers, warehousemen. There was not much more room before, but they had the benefit of 3 male wage earners, so this meant they could live in all 4 rooms of their house. This was unusual for many. The more children that arrived, the more the pressure, obviously, on the wages to support them all. Polly went on to have 2 more sons and a daughter, Edward John, George Percy, and Alice Esther. Shortly after the birth of Alice Esther, Polly's brother left home to begin a family of his own. And whilst this was good news for him, it meant the loss of 1 wage earner. In 1862, a few Virginia-based American businessmen broke off from their New York investors and came to London as a base. One was called George Peabody. His plan, in a brief nutshell, for which I could discuss more in a further video, was to make a generous philanthropic gift to the poor and the needy. Many possibilities were discussed, but housing concerns amongst the working class was felt by Peabody to be the direction he should go in. He had never married, nor did he have legitimate children, so in his retirement, the control of his merchant banking firm, Peabody & Co., was taken on by his partner, J.S. Morgan, of the very famous Morgan family. So Peabody began to work on the idea of social housing. His stipulation was for the housing to be only for the poor with good moral character, to be a good member of society, and no one that should be excluded on the grounds of religious beliefs. The homes would have a ground floor, spacious bath area with gas-heated water. Water sinks were put in each corridor, so it was like a sort of apartment block, if you like. All of these luxuries, as they were considered, of the bath area and the water sinks and indoor toilets, was at the expense of the trustees and the free for the residents. There was also a laundry room in the attic of each development. These were built at Stamford Street. So, in 1876, the Nichols family were judged as an ideal match for this scheme at Stamford Street. They were proven under the trustees of Peabody to be of good morals with no indication of alcoholism. The other criteria, before moving in, was that each household member needed to provide proof of inoculation against smallpox, which had been rife for many decades. So this, after years in a small ramshackle dwelling or two, would have been thrilling for Polly and her family. A proper stove to cook on, a working indoor toilet, and a marvel of marvels, privacy. Polly's father went to live with his son and family. The weekly rent was around 6 shillings and 8pence. All residents were expected to keep communal spaces clean. Children were allowed to play outside in the courtyard. Homes could not be sublet, nor could a shop be opened on the premises. Women were barred from taking in laundry. They were told anyone who broke the rules could be turned out, but it seems from a journalist in the Telegraph of this time that this rule was loosely applied. And so gossiping, drunken behaviour, etc. were looked out for by a superintendent within the building. But, as human nature is, rules were often bent and moulded, and not surprisingly, children would play in each other's houses, women would chat and gossip, etc. Some, who had ever-growing families, allowed some of their children to stay with a neighbour. Women would look after and keep a concerned eye on any widows. On 19th of April, a widow named Sarah Vidler, with her 4 children, one being her 21-year-old married daughter, Rosetta, moved next door. Rosetta was separated from her husband, who was a ship's cook, the details of which are lengthy and a little unclear, as after all this time, but what we do know is that they were separated, but not divorced. So Rosetta took up work as a charwoman or day servant. This was sadly, looking back now, considered the most poorly paid and worst regarded of all service occupations. Due to Polly's increasing family, after the birth of her new son in December 1878, she took on Rosetta to help her. Polly and her husband had, a few months earlier, exchanged their Peabody 4-room apartment to a 3-room one for financial reasons. Because Rosetta and her family lived next door, they all helped each other and got on well. And because of this increasing close bond that developed, whilst it was helpful, cracks began to show between William and Polly. It has not been confirmed, and bearing in mind the strict rules of living in a Peabody residence, it is said by her husband William that they began to argue, and it was because Polly had started to drink. Again, because of the strict rules, if she had been drinking noticeably and it was bad, they would have been asked to leave. So this is a little bit up in the air in regards to William's statement. At the time of the coroner's inquest on Polly, her father, Edward Walker, said that his son-in-law had begun an affair with Rosetta. As I said at the start, Edward and Polly had always had a close bond, so it's likely she would have confided in her father about the affair, because he said to the coroner, because of the toxic home environment with her husband, which was increasing every day, she would make regular appearances to him in her brother's house around the corner. It's hard to know, of course, but Polly had just given birth. She had a large family and would have been probably mostly exhausted permanently, as we know when we have a large family. Some have wondered too if she could have had postnatal depression. Possibly she started drinking to try to ease her worries. Regardless, between the birth of her latest child in December 1878 and the first few months of 1880, William Nichols claimed that Polly stormed out of the house at least 5 to 6 times and went to her father. Her father, Edward, also told the coroner that William had started to display, quote, nasty behaviour towards his wife. Now, I'm no expert, but in those days anyone standing up in front of a coroner or anyone in authority would be respectful and would tell the truth as best and as well as they could. So here we have Polly going back and forth, going back to her home to look after her 5 children, and then, and I quote from the records, limping back to her father for respite. Ultimately, there was no room at her father and brother's with his own family growing, and also she had a tiny infant. So it's been thought that she realised her husband had made his choice with Rosetta, and on the 29th of March, 1880, Polly walked out of her family home, handing her children over to William, the only person able to support them. By moving out of her matrimonial home, this had enormous consequences. Separating was not uncommon, but basically and sadly it spelt the end of a woman's, quote, respectable status in the community. It also meant she was committing herself to possibly embracing poverty in all matters of safety concerns. As we know, there were double standards in Victorian society. A man could divorce his wife for adultery, but a woman had to prove beyond doubt her husband was guilty of it. By 1878, under the Matrimonial Causes Act, if William Nichols had been violently abusive to her and been charged before a magistrate with this, the court would have given her legal rights to separate and to get maintenance. But Polly did not have the means to go ahead with this. The reality for women such as Polly, therefore, was that she would have to secure a type of unofficial separation with the assistance of the workhouse, claiming that they had been deserted by the husband. Polly would have had to have gone through a verbal examination to assess whether she was worthy or not to claim separation and any financial relief from her husband. It was likely extremely intimidating, and from the records it was more like an inquisition. Like many women in her position, she would have stood in the workhouse drab uniform with a greying cotton cap. There would be judgment and shame. Everything about her life would have been laid bare. In today's climate, it might be hard for us to understand this, but women had no real rights. They couldn't vote, etc., etc. Her child, also under law, belonged to her husband. Whichever choice Polly made now, she faced an empty existence, because a woman without a husband and family was viewed with suspicion and little understanding. Her age too was against her, because the idea of a woman of childbearing age in those days, whether or not she could support herself by laundry work or charing, in a Victorian eye considered living and enjoying the single life, was just not done. One thing William Nichols did do was pay her 5 shillings a week maintenance, but once Polly was gone, Rosetta was able to move in with William Nichols. In 1882, Rosetta seems to have learned, quote, that her own husband had emigrated to Australia, ... so they could live together, but because of the rules of the Peabody Social Housing Scheme, they could no longer live there, so they would need more money moving elsewhere. So it seems under the Matrimonial Causes Act, William claimed that Polly was living with another man and committing adultery, simplistically put, freeing him of the maintenance money of 5 shillings a week, which would give him and Rosetta extra for their new dwelling. There is a record on the 1881 census that a Mary Ann Nichols was living with a George Crawshaw in a room at 61 Wellington Road, Holloway, London. George is recorded as being a scavenger, and Mary Ann Nichols' occupation states laundry work. It said that they were married, but not to each other, so they were open and honest about that. Maybe William had heard of this, as gossip travelled fast, and it helped his case in being with Rosetta and stopping the maintenance money. According to Polly, brackets Mary Ann under the census then, she told her father she was not in an intimate relationship with George, so possibly it was a need for both to get somewhere to live to avoid the workhouse or sleeping rough, because couples could manage that much more easily than a single person. However, records show that Polly had no choice on the 24th of April 1882 but to enter Lambeth Union Workhouse indefinitely. It's noted that she spent a short time in the infirmary there. She remained at the workhouse 11 months. She left, tried to find her feet, but it's noted she went back. A workhouse was not a prison, but they were called inmates, although they could go wherever they chose, but with not much hope of employment or any money. It was a vicious cycle of poverty. Often the only way to escape the workhouse was to live on the streets, beg, prostitute yourself to get money to eat or a night's lodging. There was a little light after Polly left the workhouse, that second time, in that her father and brother took her in. Her brother Edward and his wife had 5 children. Polly's father, too, was living there, so it was a very tight squeeze. Her father, in an emotional claim in the inquest, said he would have never turned his daughter out so long as he'd had a roof over his head, but life with Polly, the grown woman, had become difficult. If Polly had taken up drinking as her marriage failed to dull the pain, then it seems that she developed possibly a real thirst and need as time went on. No one was allowed to drink in the workhouse, so in a way, when she stayed there, it might have helped her to take the craving away. But once she left her father, he stated sadly she spent a lot of time in public houses, so arguments began within her brother's home with her brother and her father when she was drinking heavily. Her father, at the coroner's inquest, insisted she was not fast or improper. Eventually Polly left after a disagreement in 1884, and her father stated she thought she could try and better herself, so I let her go. It seems she met and maybe had a relationship in March 1884 with a Thomas Stewart Drew, a blacksmith living in a neighbouring street to her father and brother. He was widowed with 3 children, so Polly could have been a godsend, helping with his children and the house. It seems he offered her a settled home and helped her to feel useful in the role of wife and mother again. According to her father in 1886, she appeared respectable in both dress and demeanour. Polly met Thomas through sad circumstances. It was this. One evening, a month or so before she moved in with Thomas around midnight, Polly's brother, Edward, and wife had been sitting in the kitchen chatting, and just as Edward's wife, Mrs. Walker, left the room to go to bed, she heard a sudden explosion from behind her. She raced back into the kitchen, only to find poor Edward's hair ablaze. The paraffin lamp had burst as he tried to turn it off. Poor Edward suffered third-degree burns to the right side of his face and chest, and whilst they rushed him to St. Guy's Hospital in the cab, he slipped into a coma and died later that evening. This was for all a huge shock, and possibly in Polly's case the loss of her sibling was yet another hard blow to take. Soon her relationship with Thomas began difficulties. She may have started drinking more again. This cannot be confirmed, but Thomas, within the next month or two, got married to another woman. So poor Polly, in the autumn of 1886, had no choice but to return to Lambeth Union Workhouse. By October 1887, as winter's chill began to set in, there were homeless adults and children sleeping rough everywhere. Shoeless children curled into balls against the National Gallery in London. In the day they congregated in their hundreds, as they often did at Trafalgar Square. Then it became thousands, as the unemployed and friends of socialism gathered with red flags, banners, shouting about working men's rights. The air, often filled with the sulphurous fogs, didn't stop the crowd. Polly was there. Amongst those who gathered for the speeches, jeers, hissing, etc., was the writer, textile designer and socialist William Morris, along with several from the Socialist League like John Hunter Watts and Thomas Wardle. The debates continued at the base of Nelson's column. On it went into late October, and they marched into the Strand to try to get to the City of London, the home of the banking world and the financial world, which it still is. The police pushed them back into the yards at Charing Cross Station. Railings collapsed, rocks were hurled, shopkeepers tried to shutter their windows. By the 25th of October, they'd made it up to Belgravia, where they bellowed revolutionary songs at the windows of high society. Polly was there. Many attempts were made to clear areas, and an Inspector Bullock, whose beat was Trafalgar Square, knew many that congregated there often, and he tried to talk and calm them. At 10 p.m, a charity worker appeared with coffee, bread, lodging house tickets for 170, quotes, outcasts. It was a bitter night, so most went with their tickets to the lodging houses. Many returned, saying they were full. Inspector Bullock offered to escort them up to the casual ward of the workhouse at St. Giles. Most refused. And as the evening progressed, many sat on the side streets of Covent Garden, drinking and smoking. Some people going past threw coins at them, so there were scuffles, not surprisingly, for the money. But that night, Inspector Bullock arrested 6 women, 2 girls and 2 youths. One woman was, you guessed it, Polly Nichols. She was taken into custody. She was, it seems, 1 over the 8, as we say, and didn't go willingly, and indeed put up a fight in the police station and spent the night in a cell. As is the norm, the next morning, bleary of eye and rather ragged looking, she stood before the magistrate. A journalist at the time from the Evening Standard remarked, Nichols was the worst woman in the square. It was described how she had a group of other women made a business of begging beneath the terrace near the National Gallery. Apparently they would take off their shawls and whenever a respectable person, quotes, appeared, shook as if freezing cold in order to gain sympathy. Personally, I think they probably were cold. They had no real warm clothing, nowhere to go. All they had was to ask for help. Today it's hard to understand the issues of going to a workhouse. I remember the stories my grandfather told me when I was about 6 or 7, of him growing up in one when he was 5, with no parents, no siblings, utterly terrified, and it affected him all his life. So, going back to Polly, for the next few months and more, we have Polly in and out of workhouses, getting a placement as a servant, losing a job, and then back into the workhouse. How lost and helpless and invisible she must have felt, living hand to mouth, cold, hungry, missing her children. There were what was called casual wards or spikes. These were temporary overnight shelters. They were not designed for comfort on purpose. They were to encourage supposedly people to not live rough, but to better themselves, to find work, as if that was easy. The food was a nauseous mix of bread and a form of watery gruel, and in order to stay there, you had to try and find work. You were made to spend 2 nights on a grubby bed for a full day's labour. Bed linen, such as it was not washed, but what they call stoved at a high temperature to kill lice and fleas. On entering, they were required to strip off their dirty street clothes and were given nightshirts after bathing in the blackened water of the communal tubs. These places were full of vermin and often attacked the residents relentlessly. The rooms were like small dormitories with no ventilation, and I think from the records they slept about 6 in each. Polly stayed in these. Looking for work in the day, any work in order to eat, but often to drink, like so many, to drown the emotional pain, no doubt. There is so much more to the true nature of poverty, but I want to focus on Polly here. So, as I say, we have Polly veering from homelessness to the odd serving job, drinking, sometimes rowdy, up in front of a magistrate, and thus this continued. On the 13th of February, 1888, she was sent, like a human parcel if you like, to Renfrew Road workhouse. The matron there knew Polly. They'd met before, and she'd given her a work placement 18 months previously. And she said she was prepared to offer Polly another placement in domestic service, hoping for a better outcome. A Mrs. Sarah Cowdrey of 16 Rosehill Road, Wandsworth, offered her a position as a servant. Mrs. Cowdrey and her husband, both in their 60s, were observant Baptists and genuinely believed in giving help to the less fortunate, but on the proviso that there was no alcohol, as they were teetotal. So, after a short time, on the morning of 12th of May, Polly arrived into their comfortable middle-class home, their only servant. She was expected to clean the rooms, cook meals, but she had her own attic room and bed. This must have been a luxury after so long tramping and just about surviving. Mrs. Cowdrey would provide her with a change of clothes, a decent bonnet, a jolly bonnet perhaps, and shoes, a nightdress, cap, pinafores, shawls, and a pair of gloves. In her first week there, Polly wrote to her dad. She wrote, quotes, "I just write to say you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place and going all right up to now. It's a grand place with trees and gardens back and front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers and very religious, so I ought to get on. They are very nice people, and I do not have much to do. I do hope you and the boy," meaning Polly's eldest son, who was by then living with his grandfather, "has work. So goodbye for the present, yours truly, Polly." And then an edit, "Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are." We do not know what Polly's life was like over the next 2 months, whether she was happy and at peace, feeling safe from attacks by drunken men, etc., or if she was lonely and missing her family. How did she cope? Not drinking. Did she get support from the church? None of this is really known. But what we do know is that on the 12th of July, Polly left the Cowdrey home with clothing and goods to the value of £3 10 shillings, which was actually quite a lot in those days. She just packed up and left. Probably, with the clothing and goods that she had, she may have gone straight to the nearest pawn shop to convert these items into ready cash. Much more use on the streets. She becomes untraceable until the 1st of August, where it is noted she spent a night in Gray's Inn, casual ward, and that she was seen going on the route to Whitechapel, where she knew there were cheap lodging houses to make her money last. She moved into Wilmot's lodging house, 18 Thrall Street, which was for females only. This place housed up to about 70 women, and she occasionally split the price of a bed with an older woman named Ellen Holland. Ellen was, it seems, the only one over the 3 weeks that she was there to make a sort of friendship with Polly, and she quotes that Polly was very melancholy, kept herself to herself, and had no male companions. She, Ellen, did not deny that Polly drank a couple of times rather heavily. What is known of Polly's last movements is through Ellen Holland at the coroner's inquest. All other documents are lost, and no official transcript survives. Ellen said Polly was at Wilmot's until roughly the 24th of August, when her money started to run out. Sometimes she was given a night's credit, but eventually turned out. Polly spent time tramping around Boundary Street in Shoreditch, then a lodging house called the White House in Whitechapel. She was seen drinking in a pub called the Frying Pan. Then, at around 2:30 a.m, Ellen Holland, who was returning from watching a large fire at Shadwell Dry Dock, saw Polly going down Osborne Street towards Whitechapel Road, staggering and unable to walk straight. When Ellen caught up with her, Polly was slumped against a wall. Ellen was worried and talked to her, she said, for about 7 to 8 minutes, and tried to convince her to return to Wilmot's. But Polly said she had no money after drinking so much, and was rather saddened by that, at the waste of the money going. At the coroner's inquest, it was the authorities and the press who decided that Polly must have been soliciting for money. There was an assumption made and based on the fact that, like many, she would often have to sleep in a dark corner of an alley with nowhere else to go, so therefore must have been a prostitute. From the start, the police and press formed theories that she was either killed by a high tip-top gang, these were groups who extorted money from prostitutes, or that she was a lone prostitute killed by a lone prostitute killer. Regardless, they decided Polly Nichols was a prostitute. End of. Ellen stated that Polly did not like her lodging at the White House, and that she was living in male and female accommodation by the time she was murdered. Polly said again to Ellen it scared her there, and promised to go back to Wilmot's in a short while. Ellen was constantly asked about Polly's morals, but Ellen denies several times that their assumptions that Polly was a prostitute was wrong. Sadly, as we now know, salacious gossip sells, drama sells. And so this idea that Polly was a prostitute, even after her father stood up, stating she was clean in her ways, the story of her being a prostitute was printed. So this version of Polly stuck and continued to be printed in major newspapers of the time and continues to this day. The story of Polly, as often portrayed, is of her boasting of her jolly bonnet, and was used to insinuate it was a way to get the business, if you like. This bonnet, as I mentioned earlier on, could have been the one given to her when in service at the Cowdreys, as listed in the items given to her when she worked there. So, sadly, to the journalists and the authorities, Polly was portrayed as just another poor, ageing, worthless female of a Whitechapel lodging house, where Polly would have made her way possibly to Wilmot's after about 2:30 a.m. It was full of dark alleys and recessed dark doorways, so she might have slumbered along and got tired and thought she'd sleep in a dark corner in her drunken state. There was little in the way of light to see, only flickers coming through windows. Possibly she slumped down in a corner to sleep. We know from Ellen's testimony, though, that she was deeply melancholic, depressed, a very private person, feeling alienated and deeply grieving. The conclusion of what happens are many, but pointed in death she would be stripped of her own self. Fabricated stories were made, and Polly, or Mary Ann Nichols as she was officially called, has become a legendary figure like the Artful Dodger, Fagin or Oliver Twist. She was born in a house in the Street of Ink, and in death would return a name in printed in the Street of Ink.